Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are today having a webinar in which we are basically exploring the implications of Hassan Nasrallah's killing and death, or when it comes to the organization of Hezbollah, the Lebanese implication, the regional implication, and so on. We'll get to that. We are definitely experiencing some of the most turmoil days the Middle East has seen in years, if not decades. And this is something that we have decided to explore today with our guest today, Dr. Colin Clarke, who is the Director of Policy and Research at the Sofan Group. He's also a research fellow at the International. So, Colin, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the opportunity. I think perhaps like many, I was surprised at the death of Nasrallah. Maybe a week or two before it happened, someone said, "Do you think the Israelis will target Nasrallah?" And I kind of said, "Well, I mean, they could do so at any time. Why haven't they done it yet?" So, the pager and walkie-talkie explosions were really kind of the prelude to what came next, the shaping operations that we saw that led to uh, the attack against Hezbollah headquarters. And so we're looking at, I think, not to be hyperbolic here, but a new reality, a new landscape in the Middle East, where this once feared and mighty violent non-state actor has been systematically dismantled over the course of a couple of weeks. Although maybe dismantled might be going too far, certainly damaged significantly with the loss of Nasrallah, an entire echelon of senior leaders, of mid-level commanders, 1,500 Hezbollah fighters taken out by the pager explosion and walkie-talkie explosion. And then I think the psychological damage of all of this, a lot of counterterrorism analysts, myself included, have said when we think about transnational terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda is the B team, Hezbollah is the A team, right? This is a group with significant capabilities, an arsenal of 150,000 rockets, precision guided munitions, drones, vast capabilities. I think a true hybrid organization, certainly a terrorist group with the ability to raise funds through criminal activities, but also significantly influencing Lebanese politics. So this is a pretty unique organization. And after the Israelis are done with, whenever this ends, I wonder what the organization looks like, what's left standing, and how do they move forward. My only certainty is that the Iranians will attempt to rebuild Hezbollah. This is the crown jewel in their so-called axis of resistance, alongside the Houthis in Yemen and various militias in Syria and Iraq, as well as Hamas and PIJ, kind of the also-ran. So I think, Hezbollah has often been the tripwire for Iran, and the Iranians feel vulnerable now that this group has been wounded so severely. I see Oren's back, so maybe I can hand it back over to him if you want to jump back into Q&A.
Thank you, Colin. Sorry for that. I'm having here some bad internet day. Sorry for that. Colin, let me go to the initial question. I'm not sure you heard me, but the question was, how does specifically the death of Hassan Nasrallah? I mean, you did speak, and I did hear you talking about the operations that happened with the communications, the killing of the Radwan force leadership, but specifically Nasrallah being the mythical almost figure with kind of larger than life character, very talented on the rhetorics, very talented on the understanding of the Israeli society. What impact will that have on the organization now that he is no longer in the?
Yeah, so when you think about the institutional memory, the legacy, he took over after Abbas Musawi in 1992. So this has been a mainstay. He's really defined Hezbollah, in this kind of generational shaping way. So I think, when it comes to organizational capabilities, it's a huge loss. Symbolically, psychologically, it's a huge loss. This is not someone easily replaced. When we look at who's coming up the pipe, Hashem Safiaddin, a lot of people say he's Nasrallah light. even if he is attempting to kind of portray himself as more of a hardliner. And then others that are still remaining, Naim Qassem, and then there's questions about his relations with the Iranians. So this is, no kidding, a crisis moment for the group. I think, the uh, the way that the Israelis have just systematically picked apart command, control, communications, doing so through both conventional and asymmetric means has, from a military analyst standpoint, has been impressive. So, and again, I think the big question becomes what next. But Nasrallah is not easily replaceable. This isn't somebody that, you just say next man up and they're running the show. I mean, it's a lot. It's a huge loss, and I think that's why the Israelis targeted him. They know that this is likely something they had been planning for some time, and it's going to take Hezbollah a long time to recover from this. And some, I have some friends that think that they won't be able to. I'm a little bit less optimistic. I think, just given Iranian largesse, given how important Hezbollah is to Iran, they're likely to dedicate significant resources to building them back up.
What do you think Iran will do next when it comes to Hezbollah? Will it try to recover its force, or will it try to maybe to establish other organization to kind of moderate the loss of what's going on now with Hezbollah? How will Iran react in the short term, but in the long term, in terms of kind of losing the Hezbollah tool that they had?
I think it's crucial that the Iranians, I mean, from their point of view, rebuild Hezbollah both in the short and the long term because it sends a message to the other proxies, right? If the crown jewel is discarded, then what does that mean for the Houthis? What does that mean for Hashd al-Shaabi? What does that mean for some of the other groups? It's already, Iran's already been significantly criticized for not coming to Hezbollah's aid, right? Somebody made a comment the other day. They said Iran's proxies fight for Iran, but Iran doesn't fight for its proxies, and that's not the reputation that you want to have, especially in a region like the Middle East, where weakness is really exposed you to certain vulnerabilities. So I think they absolutely will. The question becomes how successful are they in rebuilding this group, and how quickly can they do it? And that's going to be difficult, when you look at sanctions, when you look at all these other, punitive measures that are likely to flow from the Iranian missile barrage. And, I don't think the Israelis are anywhere close to being finished with their military operations in Lebanon. So still a lot to be seen. But I have no doubt the Iranians will work to attempt to rebuild this organization. I wonder about the nature of the relationship, right? For those that are coming up the ranks and assuming top leadership positions in the group, how do they view Tehran after what's just happened? Maybe there's some questions about, is this relationship fruitful for Hezbollah? And then clearly there's been pretty serious infiltration of this group by Israeli intelligence. Is this coming from Iran? Is it coming from senior leaders in Hezbollah? But this isn't just cyber hacking and digital snooping. There's some real human intelligence involved here.
Putting yourself in the shoes of the Hezbollah leadership at the moment, and I know it's hard because you need to kind of get into those minds, but from the perspective of what are the choices that they have, what are they basically now facing in terms of the decisions that they need to make at this moment right now?
I think it's about survival, really. That the most base, fundamental goal is to survive this onslaught in whatever shape they can, right? So I think senior leaders are going to ground. Again, really makes it difficult to fight when you can't just look at what's happening in Gaza with Hamas, right? The kind of command and control there. But I think it's self-preservation first and foremost at this point. Secondarily, I do think, and I've said this in the past week or so in public commentary, that any kind of prolonged or sustained Israeli invasion or occupation of southern Lebanon is a gift to Hezbollah. This is going to help them, with popular support. And I think it's going to remember what Hezbollah's mandate is, right? It's to destroy Israel and to export its extremist Shia ideology. When they have the opportunity to kill Israeli soldiers, that helps the group with its propaganda, with recruitment. and with kind of trying to recover its self-image after this disastrous few weeks.
Now, one of the topics that we saw Israeli media publishing coming from the IDF was that Hezbollah was maybe even preparing an onslaught, October 7th style, into the northern of Israel using their special unit, the Radwan force. How much do you think that was an existential threat that was coming from Hezbollah, that was actually something that they were planning, versus more something that was in their tool of capabilities in case the nuclear sites were to be attacked? How much do you think was it something that they were aiming to do versus developing in having in terms of a capability?
Existentialism's in the eye of the beholder. And so I think, the Israelis and Israeli friends I speak to said that some of the intelligence pointed to Hezbollah attempting to pull off an October 7th style attack into Israel. And that was just unacceptable, right? And so that's part of it. The other part of it is the timing, that potentially these pagers were being discovered, that the Israelis had to use it or lose it, right? And that kind of set off this chain of events of like, it's now or never. I think there's also a lot of other factors that make this a particularly dangerous time. One is the situation with U.S. domestic politics. I think there's kind of almost a lame duck status here, whereas if this was a different time, if we weren't 6 weeks out from a presidential election, if we had a strong incumbent, you may see the United States able and willing to exercise more leverage to restrain the Israelis. And I think that's a big topic of conversation now, which is, how comprehensive is this reprisal going to be? They're clearly going to continue to chip away at eroding Hezbollah, but there could be more, and I suspect there will be. And there's conversations about an Israeli, impending attack on Iranian soil to go after missile silos, rocket launchers, energy infrastructure potentially, and also maybe nuclear sites. So, we're not out of the woods by any stretch. And if those things happen, then Hezbollah becomes even more important. And maybe not even Hezbollah in Lebanon, but Hezbollah's worldwide network, right? You go back to the 1990s and think about some of the things that they did in Latin America. This is an organization with a worldwide presence. They can strike in Europe, North America, Southeast Asia, and that's, really their kind of bread and butter, right, is committing acts of terrorism. And you could see some kind of terror cells activated if things continue to go down this path of escalation.
So you beat me to that next question, which is, do you think Hezbollah might activate those old modus operandi like they did in the 90s in the embassy and the Jewish community attack in Argentina and Buenos Aires, and in Bulgaria as well later, a little bit in more recent, exactly more recent history. But are we seeing that as something that you see that the organization would like to do right now, or is that something that they will see maybe could be counterproductive because then they might lose international support? They might see they might be seen as kind of an ISIS type threat even, and encourage other actors to be involved in the fighting in some way or another. How much do you think that's something that they will be considering, and what motivation they might have to really go there?
Yeah, I mean, in some respects, you could view it as a use it or lose it as well, just like the pager operation. If you have this network and they're kind of scattered around the world and you're saving them for a rainy day when you really need them, is this the time, right? I mean, if the Iranian nuclear sites are bombed, that could be the tripwire that activates these cells. Because you're right, it is a cost-benefit calculation of what does Hezbollah get out of that, right? Of blowing up an Israeli embassy in Latin America. Sure, it kind of contributes to the group's propaganda, and it says, look, we're here, we haven't gone away, we're not defeated. But tangibly, what does it get you, right? It definitely gets you, like you said, international opprobrium for targeting civilians. It's not, necessarily a military target where, it's kind of within the rules of engagement or the so-called red lines. Although I think this discussion of red lines is moot. I'm not sure what the lines look like at all anymore in the region, the way that the Israelis have escalated. And, you know, I was having this conversation the other day. It's been, from a tactical perspective, a masterclass in taking a pretty sophisticated terrorist group offline, at least for the time being. Now, again, I think they're going to rebuild. This is a force of 30,000 people, or fighters. They're part of the, you know, socio-political fabric of Lebanon. They're not going anywhere, right? This isn't a group that could be killed or captured. You know, in that sense, I think it's more similar to the Taliban, right? Ethnic Pashtuns, whereas Al-Qaeda, that is a group that could really be attrited or attenuated because, you know, they're foreigners, they're, you know, but Hezbollah is home in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon. And so, you know, even another several weeks or months of warfare is not going to completely wipe this group out. But, you know, if you think about the term that the Israelis often use, mowing the grass, you know, this is a bit more than that. This is kind of more scorched earth. But once once the Israeli War Cabinet announced getting its civilians back to northern Israel as part of its war objectives, you know, I think the writing was on the wall that we were going to see something like this. Now, I don't think many would have predicted how it happened, the pager explosion, and all these other, you know, campaigns and operations, but here we are.
We at Wikistrat, we are also monitoring the public sentiment in Lebanon, and one of the things we have noticed is the increase in criticism towards the Iranian leadership for not standing up and not backing Hezbollah. And we are 100% sure part of the attack we seen the other day comes from that critique, from that sentiment from many in Lebanon and within Iran, that Iran kind of abandoned Hezbollah to its fate. Which kind of pushed the leadership to take a very bullish move on their behalf, directly firing from Iran to Israel. How much do you think this crisis is going to impact Iran-Hezbollah relations? Maybe not now in the short term, which things are still moving on the ground, but in the long term, where Shia in Lebanon might say, you know, we were in our worst hour, and Iran just wasn't there to back us up.
Yeah, I alluded to that earlier. I think that's absolutely a possibility. The problem becomes, you know, Iran is Hezbollah's sugar daddy, for lack of a better term. They're so reliant to almost be dependent on that kind of, you know, state sponsorship, particularly the financing part, right? The training they could probably, you know, that's something they could maybe do without, you know, training from IRGC Quds Force, especially when you think about the battlefield experience Hezbollah's gained fighting in Syria, right? And you know, the interoperability with other forces there, you know, representing the Assad regime, including the Wagner Group, right? So, and also they use Syria as a kind of battlefield laboratory to experiment with weapons and such. So, but I do think, you know, there could be, depending on who ends up taking over the upper echelon of leadership within Hezbollah, there could absolutely be a feeling of abandonment, that the Iranians kind of left them hanging, or, you know, hung them out to dry. And so that could, over time, certainly impact that relationship. But I don't see anyone waiting in the wings, right? No one's going to replace Iran as a sponsor of this group. And so to rebuild, they're going to be reliant on the Iranians. They're going to have to swallow the pill and deal with it.
Some of the experts we spoke to told us there is the, let's call it the the buried lead story within this bigger story is how Syria is not involved at all in any way or form.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen any Syrian neither trying to support Hezbollah indirectly or directly, in the sense that we haven't seen anything coming out of the Assad regime that might indicate that they're willing even to risk even the minimal risk of engagement with Israel just in order to support Hezbollah at this time. And this is after a Syrian civil war in which Hezbollah was very actively involved in preserving the regime. How do you see that playing in all of this? Are we seeing the Syrian regime standing aside and basically enjoying the fruits of this conflict in order to weaken Hezbollah? Is that in their interest to weaken Hezbollah in order to regain again the control over Syria? Where do you see Syria in all of this?
Yeah, That's a really good question. And the short answer is I'm not really certain at the moment. I think, again, you're in a situation where Syria is almost kind of in a fight for survival, right? It's basically become a narco state, trafficking Captagon. It's got a lot of enemies still active on its soil. But on the flip side, it's being normalized within the region again. The Emiratis have trotted Assad around. Despite the fact that he used chemical weapons on his own civilian population, there's been no real, censure from the international community, quote unquote. And so I think, uh, they're really living day to day, the Syrian regime. I'm not sure what Assad's strategy is, again, other than kind of basic survival. But you're right. I think, they clearly didn't want to become involved in this because it opens the Assad regime up, right? And this is a regime that doesn't have a monopoly on the use of force within its own territory, which is starting to kind of seem a little bit reminiscent to Lebanon, right? And if you think about the consequences of state failure, that's what produced Hezbollah in many ways, where you have, the Lebanese armed forces are unable to control territory in Lebanon. The government's either unable or unwilling to provide services for large swaths of its own population, and that's what opens the door initially to a non-state actor gaining the power and influence that Hezbollah has in the country. And so I do see parallels in that regard.
One thing that some of our experts alluded to was that as much as Hezbollah is seen as a bad alternative for Lebanon, not having Hezbollah is worse, in a sense that the demise of Hezbollah will actually add to the instability of the country, maybe even leading to the increase of Sunni radical groups related to ISIS, or even to a civil kind of unrest like we saw before, that Hezbollah, his deterrence and his power was kind of maybe not stabilizing as much as we would have liked it to see, so to speak, but definitely helping for the situation not to deter even worse, considering how fractioned Lebanon is from the religious and the different groups, social and ethnical groups that they are. So how do you see that the demise of Hezbollah could actually lead to Lebanon's deterioration into more chaos or even to a new civil war? Is that even a possibility that has been considered?
I think it's possible, but it's probably unlikely. You know, there's obviously real clear memories of the 75 to 90, 15-year civil war in that country, which ended with the Taif agreement, but really didn't end, right? And Hezbollah never disarmed, never demobilized, and that's another reason why we are where we are today. Um, you know, I think the country's economy has been devastated. This is already, you know, there's civilians being killed every day. You're dealing with refugee issues and internally displaced persons, and so there are concerns that Hezbollah or that Lebanon could start, uh, sliding more toward the the really kind of like collapsed states. If we're looking at this on a spectrum, right? You have kind of weak, fragile states, you have failed states, and you have collapsed states, kind of like a Somalia, that, things are moving in that direction. But it's really hard to say. I think much will depend on what kind of conflict resolution mechanisms end what we're seeing now, what we've been seeing throughout the region for the last year since October 7th of last year. If there are, peace agreements that flow from this, once a ceasefire is established, does the international community step up? Do regional countries step up to help rebuild some of these countries? And what do they look like in the aftermath? But leaving them as is a recipe for disaster.
When I was talking to some of the people involved in Israeli strategy and understanding a little bit the Israeli position, many of them said the keys are not at Hezbollah's hand, but actually are in Gaza with Hamas in terms of getting into a deal that if that deal is basically agreed to, that could lead to the de-escalation of the conflict, because Hezbollah basically was involved in it because of the war in Gaza. Who is holding the keys here to kind of make it everything linked together to de-escalate, versus how much is it one player at a time situation that we got into? because it seems that it all started on October 7 and it's all linked, but then it seems that we're starting to get into a more fractioned situation with the Houthis, militias in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Hamas, which is basically demilitarized now in Gaza. And of course, Israel is basically engaging on all fronts, and we haven't seen any move for settlement there. So who would you say is the holder of the keys? Where is the center of gravity, so to speak, in this entire situation, in your opinion?
It's probably Israel right now, because, Israel is the common denominator, right? It's fighting on all these fronts. And so, yeah, you can broker an agreement between Hezbollah and Israel, and that may not impact what Hamas is doing in Gaza. Or you could try to lump that all together, right? Uh, I'm trying to remember who it was that said, uh, you know, to go big in diplomacy, like kick it up a notch, right? Essentially, try to put everything together for some kind of grand bargain. I do think the United States would normally be, one of the kind of more influential, if not the most influential player in a situation like this from a diplomatic perspective. But again, given all the things that are happening domestically in the U.S. domestic political scene, it's really uncertain what kind of effort, what this administration can do in these remaining 6 weeks in terms of leverage, that's going to convince all the different parties and stakeholders that peace is in their best interest. At this point, I think the Israelis are content to finish the job that they started, no matter what overtures come from the Biden administration.
Where do you see Hezbollah going in terms of the leadership that is taking over? Are we likely to see? There were voices saying that as much as Nasrallah was a kind of a figure that was publicly very outspoken, he was well concerned with the conflict in Israel after 2006, which was one of the reasons why he might have joined in terms of the supporting operation of Hamas in Gaza and by attacking Israel, but there were limited attacks at the end of the day to artillery, not the massive scale that they could have in terms of the potential. And many associated that with Nasrallah's kind of being deterred from the 2006 war and the shock that he was back then. The new leadership, knowing where they're seeing right now, the level of infiltration, the level of casualties, the level of the impact that it has on the leadership organization, the organization leadership itself. Is the new leadership going to be taking this to a more radical, or are they going to continue Nasrallah's position of not directly engaging Israel from their perspective?
Yeah, I tweeted out shortly after his death, this could be a situation of the devil you know versus the devil you don't. Could you potentially get a more radical, younger, hardliner coming up through the ranks? Potentially, you could end up with that, given the kind of way that things have unfolded. And if some have described Nasrallah as a pragmatist, the hardliners will say, "Look what pragmatism gets you, right? It gets you killed." And so you very well could see support for that. And that's not uncommon in the aftermath of some kind of a decapitation strike like this. You will often have hardliners make a play for leadership positions. You also have the potential for splintering in cases like this. And I think that's a really interesting thing to look at. Think about a group like the Irish Republican Army. During multiple attempts to negotiate with the British, they peeled off several splinter groups, the Continuity IRA, the Real IRA, and others. And oftentimes these hardliners, these splinter groups tend to be very severe, very extreme, right? And so you could have a case there within Hezbollah. I don't think that would be totally out of the question. Or you could see some kind of temporary stewardship situation, where Safi ad-Din is holding, he's almost like in an acting role until likely the Iranians try to figure out, who's best suited to be at the helm of this organization.
What is, in your opinion, Israeli goals when it comes to facing Hezbollah in this conflict? What is the end game that Israel is looking for to achieve here in this confrontation with Hezbollah?
I think just, really kind of attempting to cripple this organization, right? First and foremost, it's to get their citizens home, right? That's the immediate objective. To do that, you've got to push Hezbollah back from the border. You've got to establish some kind of a buffer zone. But I think, now that the wheels are in motion, they're really looking to dismantle this organization, to kill its senior leadership, its decision makers, to damage its arsenal, and to really kind of show them that Israel is back in a place where it has achieved escalation dominance in the region, right? And the psychological impact that the Israelis took on October 7th, I think, emboldened actors like Hezbollah, said, look, this is all a myth. They're not omnipotent. Look what happened on October 7th. And the last year isn't about proving that October 7th was an anomaly. And I think, the last few weeks really show that in spades.
There is a lot of talk about Lebanon the day after Hezbollah's demise. Who's going to be benefiting from the demise of Hezbollah internally within Lebanon? Are we likely to see the central government of Lebanon? I will put it this way: are we likely to see a Lebanese government that is actually taking over and basically leveraging the weakness of Hezbollah, or are we likely to see other groups kind of emerging out of the situation, pushing Lebanon a little bit more into chaos? It relates to the question I asked before, but yeah. I'm more specifically asking, which group do you think are the winners of this situation at the end of the day in the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel?
I think it's a lose-lose. I think Hezbollah loses, and I think Lebanon loses, right? Lebanon still has to rebuild infrastructure. I don't think the government is capable of taking over a lot of the responsibilities that Hezbollah had. Think about the development of this vast social services network, or some of the other capabilities the group has. In many ways, that's because the Lebanese state, has so many capacity gaps and functional holes that it allows these groups to fill. And in some cases is happy that someone's filling that, even if it happens to be a fairly violent non-state actor, someone's taking care of it, right? I have my serious doubts that there's any winners in Lebanon in all of this, and I just don't think the capabilities there, still have massive levels of corruption, and I'm just not optimistic of where things are going on the heels of this ongoing conflict.
We spoke a little bit about Syria and the fact that we didn't see Syria involvement. One actor that was quite quiet in this whole situation and was very active when it comes to Gaza, but not here, is Turkey. Where do you see Turkey in all of this? It seems to me like as a country that is basically very much involved in the situation in Syria, very much involved in the situation in Gaza in terms of at least the rhetorics coming out of Turkey and Turkish leadership. We haven't seen much from the Turks in this regard. What are we seeing there that you think, what is leading the leadership there when it comes to this situation?
That's a really good question. That's one that I think, often after events like this, you get kind of ideas for papers you want to write or things you want to look into. The Turkey piece, I think, is fascinating too, right? Especially when you take a step back and you look at this concept of, at least in the United States, after 20 years of the global war on terrorism, we've now shifted to this great power competition mindset. And I think great power competition is happening in regions. It's certainly happening in the Sahel. It's happening in parts of Central Asia, but it's also happening in various parts of the Middle East. Like if you look what's happening in Libya, right? If you look what's happening in Syria. And so Turkey's absolutely looking to expand its influence. And I think the Turks will look to take advantage in any way that they can of kind of shifting balance of power when it comes to, ongoing geopolitics in the Middle East.
Let me shift to some of the questions that I got here on the chat. One of the questions asked was, what is, in your opinion, the worst case scenario when it comes to this conflict? Is it the escalation of Lebanon into chaos and a civil war? Is it a spillover into a regional conflict that has Iran in it? What is the worst case scenario?
Sorry, it cut out a little bit in the beginning of that question.
Let me go back to this question. Let me ask it again. In looking into this conflict, what is the worst case scenario that you see this conflict can deteriorate into?
I mean, I think we're there. I mean, I guess what's the old saying? Like things can always get worse before they get worse. But we're in a pretty rough spot. I mean, certainly there's a lot of hyperbole with World War III, but this is, we're talking about U.S. moving military muscle into the region. The Israelis about to attack Iranian soil. Iran threatening that they will. There's all sorts of actions the Iranians could take, including with the Strait of Hormuz. They could go after the Saudis' oil fields, which some have speculated they may do. So, and again, a lot of this depends on where you sit in the world. In the United States, we're so close to this election. If a war breaks out or escalates even further, it's going to impact the economy. And the U.S. is already juggling a few things. We have Hurricane Helene, dock workers strike. It's just another straw on the camel's back that leads to this kind of sense of global instability, right? And the United States is often called the world superpower, but uh, at the same time, the leverage that Washington has is probably at a nadir from my perspective.
We have seen a lot of visits in the last 2 weeks between the Iranian foreign minister that is currently in Beirut, Iranian president that is currently in Qatar. Um, what are likely to be the diplomatic efforts that Iran is currently pushing for in terms of what are they trying to achieve from a diplomatic point of view? Are they trying to achieve pressure on Israel, or are they trying to achieve some sort of pressure on Hamas? Or are they trying to basically offer some sort of or discussing some sort of a proposal to end the conflict right now? What do you perceive is the situation right now in terms of what is Iran pushing for right now at the moment?
Again, I mean, this is a common theme that we've talked about, but I think you have to look at self-preservation. That's always the goal of the regime is survival, right? Beyond that, limit damage to Hezbollah and keep the Israeli retaliation to a minimum. Um, it's really hard to say. And the nuclear issue is, the real elephant in the room, right? Do the Iranians look around the region and say the only real way for regime security is to have a weapon, right? Because you have other rogue nations in the world. North Korea is an example, and no one messes with them by and large, right? Um, yeah, even go back to the whole U.S. invasion of Iraq. Why didn't Saddam say, "Hey, I don't have any weapons"? He didn't want to look weak. That was a deterrent in and of itself. And so this could be a situation where the Iranians, and look, they've been playing games for a long time. They say one thing, they do another, where they could try to string this out diplomatically and then race for a bomb. We just don't know. But I think, again, it sounds like a bit of a broken record, but a kind of in a really perilous phase right now.
What do you think will be the implication of this situation on Russia and Russia's strategy when it comes to not only Lebanon, but also their involvement in Syria?
Yeah, so the Russians, I think, think about how badly damaged they've been from fighting in Ukraine. I see them now as kind of a junior partner to the Chinese. When we talk about great power competition, I don't really think Russia belongs in the conversation. It's typically US, Russia, China, but I don't think great powers go into their prisons to recruit conscripts like the Russians have done with Wagner. That said, they still see themselves as a player. They're have a toehold, obviously, in Syria and Libya. They want to continue to exert influence in the Middle East. And, I consider them part of this kind of rogues gallery of nations, along with Iran, along with North Korea, along with others. And so I think in some ways that axis right there is strengthening, right? The kind of autocratic axis, even if the Russians and Chinese have been knocked down a peg. And I guess the area where I'm most concerned is in the development of drones and missiles, and the kind of best practices and lessons learned and knowledge sharing that may go on between Tehran and Moscow.
One of the things we explored in a simulation we ran a few years ago about when Israel strikes Iran, when it comes to the attack of the by Israel of the Iranian nuclear sites, was the possibility that even if it's a massive success, 100% success in terms of destruction, it will only be a delay of time, meaning it will only buy you time, 4, 5, 6 years before there's a restore of capabilities to what it was. And that is the risk that any leadership needs to understand, and that is that you can't really deny, you can only delay. Looking at Hezbollah as a capability from the Iranian perspective, this is a tool, this is a capability, this is one more pawn in the arsenal of capabilities that they have. Even if they are destroyed completely, the restoration of Hezbollah, is that something that you see to be something that will take place, or is that something that you think will take decades to build? How do you think the restoration of Hezbollah's capability, military capabilities, will be after this war?
Well, I think that's where technology can be a great equalizer, right? If you look at the kind of acceleration of emerging technologies, that's going to allow Hezbollah to kind of cut the line, if you will. Whereas, 20, 30 years ago, it may have taken a decade to rebuild. Now with, missile production and, precision guided munitions and all of the, advances in unmanned aerial systems, I think it could be done in a compressed timeline. Again, a lot of it will depend on what the punitive measures imposed against Iran are in the aftermath of this. But, if you have the Chinese that are continuing to work with the Iranians and evade sanctions and really just kind of flout the rules-based system, then it's gonna be quicker. There's few actors willing to hold the Iranians accountable now, and I think we've seen that over time. And that's part of Israel's argument is, look, all of these other measures haven't worked, so we're now taking things into our own hands, and we're going to do so militarily.
Building on top of that, what do you think will be the value, success of having a buffer zone in south of Lebanon from the perspective of Israel? Is that going to be something that actually brings security and adds to the security value for the Israeli state? Or is that just going to be basically a bulge, which is more vulnerable and leading to more attacks and only a continuation of a low intensity conflict in Lebanon? How do you see this kind of a mindset, which is building buffers, geographic buffers, as a way to basically deal with the threat that Hezbollah pose?
I'll go back to kind of my last comment on technology. Geographic buffers can be, you know, overcome by longer range missiles. So is it, if the Iranians develop longer range missiles to supply Hezbollah with, then the buffer kind of, is negated in some ways. At the same time, who maintains the buffer? Is this a peacekeeping deployment? What resources are used to, to make sure that this doesn't become an area of active fighting and lead to, a cross-border kidnapping that could then restart the conflict again. So it sounds great in theory, but I'd have to know more about the details of what this would actually look like in practice before I could say how effective or ineffective it would be.
What would be a diplomatic framework that can be put in place that you think will be considered for Hezbollah as and for Iran as acceptable, and for Israel as a success when it comes to this operation? What would that kind of a diplomatic framework entail?
Again, the diplomatic framework is only as good as the level of enforcement, right? So we could agree to all sorts of things, but if there's no one to implement that agreement, like Hezbollah not having weapons, Hezbollah should disarm, Hezbollah should move back from the border. These are all things that have been decided, various UN Security Council resolutions. But if there's no enforcement mechanism, then we're, back to the status quo ante. Just a matter of time before these guys try to creep back to the border and do what they're doing. So again, but part of it's a difficult measure. If you, as Hezbollah, define yourself, your ideology, your raison d'etre as, Israel's existence, well, then how do you ever get out of this cycle? The Palestinian question is different because at least there it's potentially tied to, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole of two-state solution, but there's a clear outcome. What is, what's acceptable to Hezbollah to start behaving like, a normal player in international relations and not a militant organization? I described it as a hybrid before. How can you get this group to transition fully into something that looks more like a political party? Even if they're allowed to retain some kind of like, low-level militia to guard neighborhoods or such. How do you, and this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. My PhD dissertation, although it was 12 years ago, looked at why certain terrorist groups negotiate and others don't. And Hezbollah was one of my cases, actually. And so I've looked at the group really closely in that regard. And there's no clear answers. There's no clear, if they just get this, then the situation will be resolved, right?
One of the arguments that some of the hawks that we have been engaged with have argued is that the keys are not with Hezbollah but with Iran. And so as such, in order to deter Hezbollah and contain it, a direct hit on Iran is necessary, not necessarily continuing fighting with Hezbollah, but increasing the circle of fire to Iran, threatening assets in Iran. How much do you think that is a policy that you think will have an impact the way Israelis hawks may look and think, and how much do you think that could be a dangerous step that will only escalate this conflict further? In other words, fighting fire with fire, so to speak.
Again, the Iranians have talked a big game, but their response has been tepid and underwhelming. And again, I think the strength is reverting to those asymmetric means of terrorism outside of the region. That it's a totally different type of pain that a country feels, when you have embassies attacked in other parts of the world, than when you have, a military force that's fighting in active combat where you have soldiers killed. It's just two different things. And again, as a longtime terrorism scholar, I think we often forget or at least overlook or downplay the psychological impact. I mean, that's a real thing. That's something that terrorists plan for. I mean, again, October 7th, think about the psychological impact. That's something that's never, as an American, I think about September 11th all the time, all the time. It shaped my career. I grew up in New York. It's why I do what I do today. So these are things, you have these kind of dynamic shifts. And look, it's still a very dangerous neighborhood in the Middle East. After all said and done, even a weakened Hezbollah and a weakened Hamas, there's no shortage of threats, right? The Houthis have proven that. Kataib Hezbollah and other Iraqi Shia groups have proven that. Yeah.
One of the questions we received prior to this webinar was about the possibility that Hezbollah, due to their stressful situation that they are, will take kind of a all or nothing move and start attacking U.S. targets abroad, like embassies and so on, as a way to escalate, double down on escalation, especially in this time of that we are seeing internal U.S. politics and the sensitivity of such an attack might cause, and as a way to pressure the U.S. in order to pressure Israel. So it's a similar question I ask about Iran in terms of do you attack a stronger actor in order to pressure the other actor? Obviously, it's a different situation. But do you see Hezbollah maybe going down that road of basically saying the U.S. is arming, the U.S. is supporting, hence we should attack the U.S. Hence this could lead to the U.S. pressure in Israel to stop? Is that something that you think they're considering? And if so, what's the possibility of that actually happening?
It could be. It's just, once if a Hezbollah attack took place on U.S. soil, I mean, all bets are off. I think any kind of restraint that the administration is whispering into Netanyahu's ear goes away, and the U.S. probably joins in helping to dismantle Hezbollah completely. So it would really, I think, be a foolish mistake on their part. We know that it's a possibility because they've scouted targets and people have been arrested in the United States, including in New York, Hezbollah members for scouting targets. So that it remains a possibility, maybe a remote one, but also could be devastating. Again, this is, you're not talking about some lone actor that's inspired by ISIS propaganda and, just kind of like seeks an opportunity and goes on a stabbing rampage or a vehicle attack. And those are terrible things too. But now we're dealing with a little bit different level of sophistication, of planning, of strategy. And Iran's shown a penchant to meddle abroad, right? To even hunt down and kill dissidents. They've been really brazen and cavalier over the past year, and I think that's another element of what we're seeing now is trying to reestablish deterrence and say, these things are unacceptable. These are red lines for certain countries, and and the response may not be proportionate. It may be disproportionate, and that's the point.
As we're reaching to the final minutes, I'm going to ask you questions more related to what do you think you should do, i.e., what would you, Sir President, would do, so to speak, versus questions of analysis of what do you think they're thinking, doing, and why they're doing it. So looking at U.S. policy right now, you are talking about a multi-regional arena conflict escalating quickly at a very sensitive times during U.S. politics, domestic politics. This is definitely as close as we have been in decades to those boiling waters spilling over in the Middle East. And we're talking about from the attack on Iran's nuclear sites, Hezbollah, Lebanon, Hezbollah and Israel conflict, the Houthis in Yemen, Iraqi militias, and so on and so on. And of course, there's the whole war in Gaza going on. This is a really kind of a chaotic situation that looks like it's about to burst into a complete regional escalation between the different actors, even involving the Gulf states actors, specifically Saudi Arabia. If you are the US president right now and you need to make a policy, what would that be?
Yeah, I actually have given the Biden administration fairly decent marks on the way that it's sent carrier strike groups to the region, the way it's signaled to the Iranians that it's standing by and willing to. If you look at what Jake Sullivan said yesterday, he said there will be severe consequences against Iran, and the U.S. will help enforce those. That's stronger language than I've seen at any time. They're usually trying to be the voice of reason and caution. Now I think it's about pressing the advantage. I'll go back to a Cold War term, containment. I would do everything possible through military and diplomatic means to contain this conflict from spreading even further and from dragging the United States in. I think that's something that, after fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, the last thing the United States needs is to get involved in a war with Iran. At the same time, it needs to be made very clear to the Iranians that, funding, cultivating, unleashing an army of terrorist proxy groups throughout the region, no one's going to sit back and allow that to happen, right? And so part of that is very clear communication, signaling through, again, military and diplomatic means what the rules of the road are.
One question we dealt here a lot, and I know it's a bit hard now to imagine it, considering the fast pace of events that we have seen in the past few weeks and the past few months, was the question of what would a Trump election mean to the situation. And the scenario that we have kind of played over was, imagine this conflict maybe doesn't continue to escalate, but it doesn't also resolve, meaning that the situation will remain in such sort of a conflict a situation with both sides are still in it. And as a result, and within this, we see a Trump being elected and taking office in January. What does that mean to this situation? I mean, Trump definitely brought a different policy to the Middle East. So what does a Trump election mean to a situation such as this, or to a situation that is not resolved in regard to this conflict that we see now?
This isn't a cop-out question or answer, rather. It's an honest answer because I do think about this and I talk about this with friends and colleagues. It's so difficult to say what Trump would do because he's such a contrarian. I mean, I just finished reading H.R. McMaster's book on working in the Trump White House, and they had rules where before a big meeting, McMaster would try to prevent people from coming up and saying things to Trump like, don't say this in the meeting, because instantly he would say that thing, right? He recounts a meeting with Xi Jinping where he said, you can't say these three things, right? And as soon as they walked in, he said them right away. It's just like, so, a lot of speculation is that Netanyahu would prefer Trump to be president because he'd get a blank check and could do whatever he wants. But I don't know that he's so unpredictable. He could turn around tomorrow and say no, right? You just don't know what he's going to do because he has no grand strategy, because he has no strategic framework. It's throwing darts at a dartboard. So anybody who thinks that, Trump getting in a position back into the White House is good for them, I would caution that. We just really don't know. He's so mercurial and so kind of ad hoc that it's really difficult to say what he would or wouldn't do, especially if he's not worried about reelection.
Okay, and this is a great point to kind of conclude this webinar. Colin, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a situation that is evolving, ongoing. The pace of event is insane. Every day something else is happening. So whatever we said in this webinar, we put kind of a little starlet saying this is correct to today, to this hour, completely can change in 20, 30 minutes from now. And I want to invite you all to not only to look at this webinar's recording, but we also have a simulation report that we have ran a few years ago about when Israel strikes Iran that became very relevant as some of the options that were discussed. So I invite you all to go to our website to download our report. We are going to do another webinar about Iran. We're hoping to do it this week, maybe next. With the fast pace of events and how they are developing, we're not sure what we're going to be discussing. It might be something that we'll be discussing a few minutes before we'll decide what's the topic as things change. But with that, I want to conclude the webinar. Thank you, Colin, so much for your insights today. Thank you for everybody who joined us today. And I hope you enjoyed. And apologies for the bad internet, that kind of ruined a little bit of the experience. But thank you, everybody, for today, for joining us.
Thanks so much. Cheers.